The morning Baron Vane declared his third daughter worthless. The fire in the parlor was still lit, and the tea was still warm, and the world outside was frozen solid, as if England itself had decided to hold still and listen. He said it to a man in the corridor. He said it the way men like him said most things, loud enough to be certain, careless enough to seem casual. He did not look to see who else might be nearby. He never did. That was the particular variety of his cruelty, not that it was sharp, but that it was unthinking. A man who drops a stone from a window without checking what is below. The stone, this particular morning, fell on Cecily. She was in the parlor doorway, carrying a stack of correspondence that Mrs. Alderton's housekeeper had asked her to sort and deliver to the writing table. It was not her task. She was a guest. But Cecily had learned long ago that being the unwanted daughter in a house that was not hers meant that her hands were always available, and available hands attracted tasks the way open windows attracted cold. She stopped in the doorway when she heard her name. She heard, worthless. She heard, no portion, no prospects, temper like a wet cat. She heard, the other two married respectably. She heard, that one's a millstone. The corridor was on the other side of a plaster wall. She could not see her father's face, or the face of the man he was speaking to. She could only hear the voice, that particular voice she had known all her life, the one that carried through walls and weather and years, without losing any of its certainty. She stood in the doorway. She waited until she was sure the voices had moved away. Then she walked to the writing table, set the correspondence down, and straightened the stack with both hands, pressing the edges until they were perfectly aligned. The letters were correspondence from Mrs. Alderton's various acquaintances across the county. They were of no interest to Cecily whatsoever. She straightened them anyway. She counted them. 7 letters. She counted them again. Still 7. She stood with her hands flat on the table and looked at the frost patterns the cold had made on the window glass. They spread like fern leaves across the lower panes, intricate and without purpose. Outside, the garden was white. The bare branches of the oak trees were black against a sky the color of old linen. She was not going to cry. She had not cried about anything her father said in 3 years, and she was not going to begin again today in someone else's parlor. What she was going to do was put her left hand in her pocket, which she did. And then she was going to stand here for exactly as long as she needed to, and then she was going to go on, which she also did. This is how Cecily Vane moved through the world. She had been the third daughter of Baron Vane of Hertfordshire since the day she arrived in the world, which the Baron had greeted with the particular silence of a man who had been hoping for a son and received instead a girl he did not know what to do with. He had 2 daughters already, Eleanor and Margaret, older and prettier and more willing to perform the kind of softness men like their daughters to perform. Eleanor had married at 19, a respectable match with a man who owned farmland in Shropshire and had a steady, comfortable face. Margaret had married at 21, a match the Baron called brilliant, which meant there had been money involved that came the Baron's direction. Cecily had not married. This was not for lack of trying, on her father's part. There had been the Pemberton arrangement when she was 20, which had progressed as far as formal discussion before dissolving, for reasons that the Baron attributed entirely to Cecily's manner, and which Cecily did not speak about at all. She kept that particular story in the closed room inside herself where she kept several other things, and she did not take it out and examine it in company. What she had instead of a husband and a household, and a future that made sense to the people around her, was this: a mind that ran fast and would not stop. a knowledge of geography and mathematics and natural philosophy that she had acquired from her father's library over 17 years of being ignored in it, a dry sense of what was funny about the world, and a left hand with a faint scar along the fourth finger where a ring had once been worn and then removed, which she kept in her pocket most of the time, as though the pocket were a kind of small mercy. She was 22 years old. She was standing in Mrs. Alderton's parlor on the 7th of January, 1843, and she did not know yet that the man her father had been speaking to in the corridor was the Duke of Ashvere, who had heard everything, and who was, at this particular moment, standing very still in the corridor on the other side of the wall. Edward Calloway had returned to England 4 months earlier after 2 years in India, where he had been conducting business for the family estate, and also, in a way he did not say aloud, trying to determine whether there was a version of the life expected of him that he could actually live without going quietly mad. He was 34 years old, a duke since the age of 26 when his father died of a winter fever with unexpected speed, and he had spent the 8 years since then doing his duty in most of the ways a man in his position was required to do his duty, with the exception of marrying, which everyone agreed was the most important duty of all, and which he had somehow, season after season, failed to accomplish. It was not that no one had wanted to marry him. The opposite problem was considerably more true. He was a duke, with a sound estate and a London house, and an income that generated the kind of comfort that made mothers steer their daughters toward him at parties, like ships being steered toward a harbor in a storm. He was also, and this was something he himself observed about his own reflection with something close to clinical detachment, the sort of man that women referred to as handsome in the particular tone that meant their thinking had been briefly interrupted by looking at him before resuming normally. He had attended 11 dinner parties in the 2 months since returning to England. At every one of them, every woman he was placed near had performed for him. This was not entirely their fault. He understood the system. He had been raised inside it. But after 2 years in a country where the weather was honest and the business was direct, and the only performances were the ones you chose to give, rather than the ones the room required of you, he had come back to England and found himself at dinner table after dinner table, watching women smile in the particular way that meant they were smiling at a duke and not at him, and speak in the particular way that meant they were speaking carefully because they had been told to speak carefully around men like him, and he had begun to feel, quietly, without telling anyone, that the whole enterprise was a very slow and pleasant kind of suffocation. He had come to Mrs. Alderton's for the weekend because his mother had asked him to, and because saying no to his mother required a specific kind of energy he had not felt equal to this particular week. He had arrived early. He had been standing in the corridor when Baron Vane arrived, and he had introduced himself to the Baron, and they had spoken briefly about shooting conditions and the roads from London, and then the Baron had said what he had said. He had not meant for Edward to hear it as anything in particular. It was just a father sorting his daughters the way a man sorts papers. This one useful, this one not, this one a problem, file accordingly. But Edward had heard it. And then he had heard, from the room on the other side of the plaster wall, the sound of someone straightening letters, that small, precise, deliberate sound. Not the sound of someone weeping, not the sound of someone storming, just someone very carefully putting 7 letters into a perfect stack, as though order were the one thing in the room that she could control. He stood in the corridor for a moment after Baron Vane had moved away. He thought, I would like to know what that person looks like." This was unusual for him. He was not, in general, a man who formed immediate curiosities about people he had not met. He was careful. He took his time. He observed. But there was something about that sound, the absolute quietness of a person deciding not to break, that caught in him like a splinter. Mrs. Alderton arranged dinner the way she arranged everything, with cheerful, absolute authority. She was a woman of 53 who had buried one husband and outlasted another, and emerged from both with her good humor intact and her property consolidated, which she considered the ideal outcome of matrimony. She had known the Baron for years and had invited Cecily specifically because she felt, in the particular way she felt about most things, that Cecily needed removing from her father's house at regular intervals, the way certain rooms need opening to fresh air. She placed Cecily at the lower end of the table, which was where the ranking fell. This was not Mrs. Alderton being unkind. It was Mrs. Alderton being accurate. The upper end of the table belonged to the Duke, and to Lord and Lady Harrowfield, and to the Pemberton cousins who were distant enough relations that Cecily did not have to feel the specific awkwardness of their name, and to Mrs. Alderton herself, presiding with a warmth that managed to include the entire table without condescending to any of it. The lower end of the table had a retired captain named Colonel Marsh, who was very interested in his own opinions, and two young women from the neighborhood who were interested in the Duke and kept directing their conversation generally upward in his direction, and a gentleman named Mr. Fawcett, who was 40 and pleasant, and talked with considerable confidence about the Bengal trade routes. Cecily listened. Mr. Fawcett said that the routes through Calcutta had become severely complicated since '41 due to the pressures of local competition. He said this in the tone of a man who is absolutely certain of a fact that he has not recently verified. Cecily said carefully that she believed the complications had actually eased somewhat since the new agreements of '42, and that the primary pressure on the routes at present was not local competition, but the volume of cotton goods flowing the other direction, westward, which was creating a different kind of problem entirely at the London docks. Mr. Fawcett looked at her. He looked the way men looked at her when she spoke in this way. A brief, involuntary recalibration, somewhere between surprise and annoyance. "Is that so?" he said. "I believe so. Yes," Cecily said, and returned to her soup. She did not look to see who else at the table had noticed. She never did. She had said what was accurate. Whether anyone received it was their own business. She became aware, at some point between the soup and the fish course, that someone at the upper end of the table was watching her. She did not look up immediately. She finished her thought about the soup. Then she looked. The Duke of Ashvere was watching her, with the particular expression of a person who has just noticed something that they want to examine more carefully. Not the way men sometimes watched women at dinner. That was a different kind of looking entirely, and she knew what it felt like. This was different. This was the look of someone who was paying attention, someone deciding whether a thing was interesting. She met his eyes for a moment. Then she looked back at her plate, because she had been raised with manners, whatever her father said about her temper. After dinner, Mrs. Alderton arranged the company in the drawing-room with the efficiency of a general deploying troops, and Cecily found herself near the bookcase with a cup of tea that had gone slightly cool, which was fine. She preferred her tea on the cooler side. She had learned to prefer most things the way she actually encountered them rather than the way they were supposed to be. The Duke crossed the room toward her. She was not expecting this. She prepared herself, in the half-second before he arrived, to be polite and brief and unremarkable, because dukes, who crossed rooms toward women at dinner parties were usually doing so because the room had arranged them that way, and they were doing their social duty, and the correct response was to make that duty as painless as possible for everyone involved. He said, "You were right about the Bengal roots." She looked at him. "I spent 2 years in India," he said. "The cotton problem at the docks has been building since 41 at least. I think you understated it, actually." Cecily considered this for a moment. "I didn't want to be rude to Mr. Fawcett," she said. "You were still right. Being right and being rude are not the same thing." "No," he said. "Though most people treat them as though they are." She looked at him properly then. Not the polite, managed looking of dinner table manners, but actually looking. He was tall, in the way that some men were tall, without appearing to have arranged themselves that way deliberately. His face had been in weather. He looked like a man who had spent time outdoors in serious climates and had come back with a different sense of what indoors was for. His eyes were gray-brown, attentive in a way that was neither flattering nor performing. He was simply looking at her the way she had looked at him, directly, with the intent to understand something. "You read," he said. It was not a question. "Extensively." "What?" "Geography, mathematics, some natural philosophy, history when I can find it. Mr. Darwin's paper on coral reefs, which I think is one of the most interesting things written in the last 20 years, though I don't expect many people here to agree with me." He was quiet for a moment. "I read it in 42, he said. "On the ship." Cecily did not say, "That is remarkable." She did not say, "What a coincidence." She said, "What did you think of the subsidence theory?" And they talked about coral reefs. They talked for 40 minutes about coral reefs, and subsidence, and the Indian Ocean, and the particular quality of the water around the Maldives, which he had seen and she had only read about. They talked about the difference between reading a place and being in a place, and about whether reading could approximate the knowledge of presence, and about the Bengal trade routes again briefly, and about a book on mathematical principles she had found in Mrs. Alderton's library that turned out to also be one of the books he owned. She did not notice, because she was talking about interesting things with someone who was responding with actual thoughts about those interesting things, rather than polite redirections, that the rest of the room had noticed them talking and was drawing conclusions with the rapid collective intelligence of people who have nothing better to do than monitor a duke's conversations. She did not notice, because this kind of social monitoring had never seemed important to her, which was one of the things her father meant when he said her temper was difficult. He did not mean she was angry. He meant she was unmanageable in the specific way that people are unmanageable when they simply do not care about the things you need them to care about. She noticed when Mrs. Alderton caught her eye across the room and gave her a very small, very satisfied smile. Cecily looked away. He found her the following morning in the library. This was not, on his part, accidental. He had inquired of Mrs. Alderton's housekeeper whether there was a library in the house, and the housekeeper had said yes, and had also said, with the tone of someone adding a detail they thought might be useful, that Miss Vane generally took her mornings there. He knocked on the open door. She was standing at the window with a book held open in both hands, reading. She was wearing a gray dress that was perfectly adequate and entirely unfashionable by about 3 years, which told him something about the household budget. Her hair was pinned up in a style that was neat and simple, without the elaborate arrangements that suggested someone had spent an hour constructing an impression. She looked, in the library light, like a person who existed primarily for herself, which he found extraordinary in the specific context of the world they both occupied. "Good morning," he said. She looked up. There was a brief moment of what he thought might be surprise, but she folded it away before he could be certain. "Good morning," she said. "I was looking for the library. You found it." He came in. The room was modest, for a country house library: 2 walls of shelves, a writing desk near the window, 2 chairs near the fire. It smelled of old paper and coal smoke, which he had always thought was the best possible smell a room could have. He looked at the shelves. "May I?" he said, gesturing. "It's Mrs. Alderton's library," Cecily said. "I can't speak for her shelves. I'm asking whether you mind." She looked at him for a moment. "No," she said. "I don't mind." He began looking at the shelves. She went back to her book. The fire was doing its work. Outside, the frost had not lifted. Inside, the silence between them was the kind of silence that 2 people can occupy without discomfort, which is a rarer thing than most people appreciate. After a while, he said, "What are you reading?" "A History of the Ottoman Empire." "Which part?" "Suleiman the Magnificent, the expansion into North Africa. I have a book on that in London, written by a Venetian diplomat in 1540. It's a primary source, which means it's extremely biased and also completely riveting." Cecily lowered her book slightly. "I would read that," she said. "I know," he said. He was still looking at the shelves. "He said it the way you say something that is simply true, without ceremony." She observed the side of his face for a moment. He was reading spines, genuinely, not performing the reading of spines. His attention was real. This was, in her experience, rare in people who held his kind of position. People with power generally had the power to be attended to rather than to attend, and they developed habits accordingly. He did not seem to have those habits. He seemed to have kept a different set. "Why did you go to India?" she asked. He considered this. "Initially, business. The estate has interests there." "And less initially?" He looked at her then. He had the expression of a person deciding whether to give the real answer or the acceptable answer, and choosing the real one. "Because I needed to be somewhere that was not a dinner party," he said. Cecily looked at him for a long moment. Then, quietly, she began to laugh. It was not performative laughter. It did not arrive on schedule, shaped into the appropriate social size. It was the kind of laugh that comes from genuine recognition, from suddenly seeing your own interior on someone else's face. It was small and honest, and it changed her face entirely. He found he was smiling, not performing a smile. Actually smiling, which was a different thing. "My mother," he said, "would like me to point out that India was also not a dinner party. It was a series of business meetings in terrible heat." "That sounds more tolerable," Cecily said. "Considerably." They sat together in the library for another 2 hours, reading their respective books, occasionally exchanging remarks about the contents thereof. Mrs. Alderton, passing the door once, observed this arrangement and said nothing, which was itself a kind of comment. The conversation between the Duke and Baron Vane took place the following morning, in the small sitting room that Mrs. Alderton had set aside for guests who needed quiet. The Duke had requested it. The Baron arrived expecting to talk about shooting. The Duke said, very directly, that he wished to open formal proceedings for the hand of Miss Cecily Vane. The Baron stared at him. The Baron had been operating, since last night's dinner, with a particular anxiety that he managed by ignoring it. That the Duke had been seen talking at length with Cecily. The Baron had told himself this was nothing. Duke spoke to many people. Cecily was simply geographically convenient. By morning, the Duke would certainly be directing his attention toward the Harrowfield niece, or one of the neighborhood girls who had been positioned specifically to receive that attention. He had not been expecting this. He said, "Cecily." "Yes," the Duke said. The Baron's mind made a rapid, complicated journey. He was a man who was genuinely more comfortable making calculations than making conversation, and the calculation here was running at great speed. Cecily had no dowry. The estate had absorbed what little there was 3 years ago during a particularly bad harvest. A standard arrangement would require the man to accept that lack or negotiate around it, which was uncomfortable for everyone, which was precisely why Cecily had remained unattached. But a duke did not need a dowry. A duke brought the resources. A duke, in fact, could bring enough resources that the absence of a dowry became irrelevant, and might even, in some arrangements. "There would be no question," the Duke said, as though he were reading the calculation, "of a dowry from your side. I would propose a reverse arrangement. A sum held in trust for Miss Vane directly, at twice the standard amount for a match of this kind." The Baron heard the words, "Twice the standard amount." The Baron had not expected, "Twice the standard amount." He said cautiously, because he was not a man who left negotiations on the table, "I wonder whether—" "I'm not negotiating," the Duke said pleasantly. "That's the arrangement. I'm telling you the terms." The Baron looked at this man across the sitting room and experienced a very specific variety of being placed in his proper size. It was the experience of dealing with someone who genuinely did not need him and was doing him the courtesy of speaking to him directly rather than simply acting without consultation. "She can be difficult," the Baron said. He said it automatically, from habit. "I'm aware she has opinions," the Duke said. "That's not a difficulty. That's a preference." The Baron looked at the fire. He thought about what he had said in the corridor yesterday morning. He had a faint, uncomfortable feeling that the man opposite him had heard it. He chose not to examine that feeling directly. Men like Baron Vane rarely examined their uncomfortable feelings directly. They filed them somewhere dark and moved on. "I'll require time to—" "Take until this evening," the Duke said. "That should be sufficient." The Baron took until that afternoon. He told himself for the rest of the weekend and for the months that followed that he had always seen something in Cecily that others missed. He told the story in this way to Eleanor and Margaret and to his wife's sister and to anyone who would listen. He had a gift for revising his history that he exercised regularly and without guilt. Cecily found out at 3:30, when her father came to the library. He knocked, which was unusual. He stood in the doorway with the expression of a man who is trying to arrange his face into something and not entirely managing. He told her, in brief, a duke, formal proceedings, an arrangement he had agreed to on her behalf, very favorable terms. She should be grateful. He said, "Grateful," more than once. He said, "This is more than you might have expected." He said, "You'll want to write to your sisters." Cecily sat with the history of the Ottoman Empire open on her lap and listened to all of it. Her face did not change in any particular way that her father could read. He was not good at reading her, which he had always interpreted as her fault. When he finished, she said, "Thank you for informing me." Her father waited, perhaps for some demonstration of gratitude or surprise or relief that he could carry with him and feel good about. She did not provide one. He left. She sat in the library for some time after the door closed. She picked up her book. She read 2 pages. Then she became aware that she had no idea what those 2 pages had said, which was unusual for her. She generally remembered what she read. She put the book down. She thought about the man who had talked to her for 40 minutes about coral reefs and had known the Darwin paper, and had looked at her. Not at a performance of her, not at the category she represented in the social structure, but at her, with the particular, clean attention of someone who was genuinely attempting to understand something. She thought about her father's voice through the plaster wall. She thought about the 7 letters she had counted twice. She thought about the Pemberton arrangement, and what had ended it, and what she had said to herself, in the weeks afterward, about what she was worth, and what she was not, and what anyone was ever going to see when they looked at her. She stood up. She put her left hand in her pocket. She went to find the Duke. He was in the East Garden, which was the only part of the grounds that caught afternoon light in winter. She found him standing near the stone wall at the garden's far end, looking at the frozen ornamental pond, which had a thin layer of ice the color of clouded glass. He was not doing anything in particular. He was simply standing there in the cold, in the way of a person who is comfortable with their own company, and does not require an occupation to justify being somewhere. She came to stand beside him. She did not begin with pleasantries. She said, "Why?" He did not pretend to misunderstand the question. He turned it over for a moment, in the way she had observed he turned things over, not performing the consideration, actually doing it. "Because," he said, "you corrected a man at dinner for being wrong, and you didn't look to see if anyone was watching when you did it." Cecily looked at the frozen pond. "That's a very small thing," she said. "No," he said. "It's a very specific thing, which is different." She was quiet for a moment. She was waiting, she realized, for the list. She had not known she was waiting for it until she noticed herself doing it. The list was the thing that always came, the arrangement of what she was supposed to adjust, the accounting of her deficiencies, the costs she was expected to pay for being difficult, for having opinions, for failing to perform the right kind of softness at the right moments. The Pemberton arrangement had come with a list. Her father's opinion of her came with a list so long it had essentially become a weather pattern, something she moved through rather than reacted to. The Duke did not produce a list. He said, "I should tell you that I heard what your father said yesterday morning." Cecily's hands were both in her pockets now. She looked at the ice. "I assumed you might have," she said. "I want to be direct about it," he said. "Not because it requires a response from you. You don't owe me anything about that. But because I don't want there to be something unacknowledged between us, if this proceeds." "You're being careful," she said. "I am," he said. "I think careful is appropriate here." She looked at him. "What did you think," she said, "when you heard it?" He thought about this the way he thought about things. "I thought," he said, "that I would like to know what a person sounds like who straightens a stack of letters when the world is terrible." Cecily did not say anything for a moment. "That's a strange thing to want to know," she said. "I know," he said. "And now you know." "I know somewhat. I think there is considerably more." The cold was significant. Her breath made a small cloud when she exhaled. The oak trees at the garden's edge cast long shadows across the frozen ground, shadows that reached all the way to the wall where they were standing. She said, "I am not sure I know how to do this." "Do what?" "Be seen by someone who is actually looking." He was quiet after that, not the quiet of not knowing what to say, but the quiet of understanding that some things did not need a response, only presence. They stood at the frozen pond for a while. She did not take her left hand out of her pocket. Not yet. That was not a thing that happened in a cold garden in January, because a man had been decent to her for 2 days. That was a slower thing. She knew enough about herself to know that. but she was standing here. She had come to find him rather than hiding in the library. That was something. That was, in fact, quite a lot. The engagement was formalized the next morning, with the appropriate letters written by the appropriate people. Mrs. Alderton witnessed the relevant conversation and provided tea afterward, with the focused satisfaction of a woman who has arranged something she considers correctly done. The news traveled, as such news travels, with remarkable speed for something that happened in a country house during January. By Thursday, the London drawing rooms had received it. By Friday, the Baron's other daughters had received their letters. Eleanor's reply arrived within a week. It was congratulatory in the way that letters are congratulatory when the person writing them is experiencing a complicated mixture of genuine goodwill and the particular surprise of having been wrong about something for years. Eleanor had always found Cecily difficult. She still found Cecily difficult. She was now reconsidering whether difficult and wrong were the same thing, which was progress, of a kind. Margaret wrote 2 days after Eleanor. Her letter was shorter and more direct. It said, "I am glad for you." She had underlined glad, which told Cecily something about the effort that sentence had cost her. Their father wrote nothing, which was itself a form of communication she had long since learned to read. Baron Vane, in company, told the story of Cecily's engagement with warmth and pride, adding small details that improved his own judgment in the telling. He had, in this version, always noticed something particular in Cecily. He had, in this version, encouraged her in her reading. He had, in this version, seen what others had missed. Cecily heard, through the efficient channels of country society, what version of the story her father was telling. She did not correct it. Correcting it would require caring about his credit in a way that she had, in the 3 years since the Pemberton matter, very deliberately stopped doing. He could have the story. He could have whatever version of himself he needed to build in order to sleep at night. She no longer needed him to see her accurately. She was, for the first time in her life, being seen accurately by someone whose opinion she had decided to admit mattered. That was a strange feeling. Not unpleasant, just strange. Like a window opened in a room that had been closed for a long time, and the air coming in was neither warm nor cold but simply fresh, and the freshness itself was the remarkable thing. They were formally engaged for 4 months before the wedding. This was standard. What was not standard, or at least not common in Cecily's experience of how these arrangements generally worked, was that during those 4 months, he wrote to her. Not the letters that engagements typically generated, the formal, managed correspondence. That was essentially a series of social procedures in paper form. He wrote actual letters. He wrote about things he was reading, and things he had noticed, and questions he was genuinely asking. He wrote 3 pages about the coral reef paper and what he thought Darwin would do next. He sent her the Venetian diplomat's account of Suleiman, with several pages dog-eared and 3 small pencil marks in the margins, where he had disagreed with the translation. She wrote back. She had not, since the age of 15, and the correspondence she had kept with a mathematics tutor who had briefly, eccentrically, agreed to write to the Baron's 3rd daughter about geometry, written letters that she actually enjoyed writing. She had not known she missed it until she found herself at the writing desk in the early morning, before the household was active, filling pages without having to think about what she was allowed to say. She told him about the Ottoman expansion into Algeria, which she had now read about in 4 different sources that all disagreed with each other, and about the specific disagreements and what she thought they said about the people who wrote them. She told him about a conversation she had overheard between two women in the village about the correct way to make a winter pudding, which she found unexpectedly interesting for what it revealed about the geography of recipe transmission. She told him, in one letter, about finding a spider in her room that had built an elaborate web between two candle holders, and having decided not to disturb the web, which meant she had been reading by firelight for a week. He wrote back about the spider with complete seriousness, including what he believed to be the species based on her description, which was a garden spider, and which was, he said, genuinely impressive in its engineering, given the conditions. Cecily read that letter twice, and then folded it carefully, and put it in the box where she kept things that mattered. He visited twice during the 4 months, once in London at a gathering at his mother's house, and once in Hertfordshire. The London visit was managed by a considerable number of people, and had the slightly managed quality of all such formal occasions. But there were 20 minutes at the end of the evening, in the library of his mother's London house, where they stood at the shelves and argued about whether an account of the 30 Years' War was or was not the most useful primary source on the period, and those 20 minutes were better than the preceding 2 hours of managed socializing combined. The Hertfordshire visit was shorter and included dinner at the Baron's table, which was an experience Cecily observed with the detached curiosity she had developed as her primary mode of surviving her father's company. She watched her father manage his face around the Duke with the fascination of someone watching a creature they have studied for years reveal a new behavior. The Baron was deferential. The Baron was gracious. The Baron told a story that made himself sound wise and far-sighted, and waited for the Duke to respond with confirmation. The Duke listened politely and responded with something that was technically not disagreement, and also technically not agreement, and changed the subject to the regional agricultural yield data, about which he had evidently informed himself with some care, and the Baron was so pleased to be asked about his land that he did not notice the redirection. Cecily noticed. Afterward, she told him, briefly, walking in the garden, that she had noticed. He said, "It seemed kinder. To him or to me? To the evening," he said. She found, as she had been finding at regular intervals since January, that the appropriate response to this man was often simply to stand with whatever he had said for a moment, rather than reaching immediately for a reply. The wedding was in May, at the church in the village near the Ashvere estate, which was in Wiltshire, which Cecily had never visited but had read about. The estate was called Calloway Park, and it sat on a rise above a river valley that was, in May, green in the particular English way that only exists for about 6 weeks before summer changes it. A green so absolute and varied that it seemed like a conversation between all the possible versions of the color. She stood in the church and said the words clearly and meant them, which she had not been entirely certain she would be able to do until she was doing it, and which turned out to be simpler than she had expected, because she was saying them to him rather than to the institution, and saying true things to someone who was paying actual attention was something she had some practice at. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, stood in the front pew and cried, which Cecily found reassuring. A mother who cried at her son's wedding rather than assessing the bride's dress and posture throughout the ceremony was a mother who was there for the right reasons. Eleanor attended and brought her husband and both her children. Margaret attended with her husband, who was richer than Eleanor's and slightly less pleasant to be in a room with, and they sat together in the second pew and watched the ceremony with the expressions of people who are revising a long-held opinion and finding the process mildly inconvenient. Baron Vane attended in the very good coat he had purchased for the occasion. He stood correctly and said the right things when asked, and in the receiving line afterward told 3 people, in Cecily's hearing, that he had always seen something in her. She did not correct this. She had, by May, released her father's version of events to whatever future it chose to inhabit. She could not make him see her accurately. She could not unsay what had been said in the corridor. She could not retroactively fill the closed room inside herself with different memories. What she could do was stand here, in the May light, in the Wiltshire church, with her left hand out of her pocket and holding the hand of the person who had told her that straightening 7 letters in a bad moment was something worth noticing. Her left hand was in his right hand. The scar on her 4th finger was there. He had seen it, in February, in the library at his mother's house, when she had reached for a book on the shelf above her, and he had been near enough to notice, and he had not asked about it, which told her something about his particular quality of respect. He had simply registered it, the way he registered everything, and filed it in whatever internal place he kept things that were not his to ask about until they were offered. She had not offered it yet. Maybe in summer. Maybe when the valley was at its greenest and they had been in each other's company long enough that the rooms between them had been properly aired. There was time. That was, she realized, the thing she had not had for a very long time and had perhaps not quite believed was real. Time. The sensation that the future was not a series of diminishments to be survived, but a set of rooms to be opened in the right order, without rush, in the company of someone who was genuinely interested in what was inside each one. The first week at Callaway Park was occupied with the business of arrival, the staff to be introduced to, the rooms to be understood, the quiet accumulated life of the house to be slowly made familiar. He showed her the estate carefully and without ceremony, which meant he showed it the way someone shows another person something they actually love, not performing the pride of ownership, but walking through it as though he wanted her to see what he saw. The library at Callaway Park was large. It was the kind of library that generations of thoughtful people build, without intending to build anything in particular, shelf by shelf, year by year, and it had the quality of such libraries, disorganized in a way that was deeply logical once you understood the logic, which was the logic of several different minds that had each organized the books according to what made sense to them individually. He showed her this on the 3rd day. He said, "This is the room I want your opinion on, specifically." She looked at the shelves for a long time. She said, "How many books are there?" He said, "I've never counted." She said, "I'll count them." He said, "That will take weeks." She said, "Good." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that she thought, later, was perhaps the truest thing he had said to her in all the months they had spoken. He said, "I want to say, I know I cannot undo what was said. What your father said. I know that a man saying you are valuable doesn't simply cancel what another man said about your worth. That's not how it works." She stood at the library shelves with her back to him for a moment. She said, "No, it's not how it works. I know that what I think about you doesn't replace what you think about yourself." "Good," she said, "because I have some decided opinions on that subject." "I expect so," he said. "But," she said, and she turned around, "it is not nothing. What you think. I want you to know that it is not nothing." He nodded. They stood in the library of Callaway Park, which smelled of old paper and beeswax, and the particular damp quality of old stone walls in May, and the afternoon light came through the windows and made long patterns on the floor. "I would like," Cecily said, "to begin at the natural philosophy section, because I think whoever organized it was either a genius or had never read a word of natural philosophy in their life, and I cannot tell which from here. My grandfather, he said. Almost certainly the latter. She turned back to the shelves. She began. They settled into each other with the careful patience that two self-possessed people apply to the problem of genuine companionship. It was not the delirious speed of people who have been starved for contact. They were both too careful for that, too accustomed to their own company, too aware of what it cost to let someone in quickly and find they had been let into something that was not real. It was more like the coral reef paper, slow accretion, something added at each tide. Over weeks and months, barely visible, and then one day a structure existed that had not been there before, and it was solid, and it was precisely fitted to the conditions it had grown in. He gave her the run of the library. This seems like a small thing. It was not a small thing. He gave her access to his correspondence about the estate when she expressed interest in the management of it, which she did because it turned out that the estate had a complex relationship with several of the tenant farms that bore on agricultural economics in a way that genuinely interested her. He introduced her to his agent, and then stepped back and let the conversation happen between them, which the agent found disconcerting, and then found, over several conversations, more efficient than most of the conversations he had with landowners' wives, because Cecily had read the relevant documents and arrived at meetings with actual questions. She told him in June about the Pemberton matter. Not all of it. A version of it that was precise and brief and contained the essential facts without requiring her to revisit the rooms inside herself that she had not yet fully reopened. She told him the engagement had ended. She told him the manner in which it had ended. She told him that she had handled the ending better than she had expected to handle it at the time and worse than she had understood at the time, and that understanding the difference had taken 2 years. He listened. He said, "I'm sorry that happened." She said, "It was some time ago." He said, "It was some time ago. Doesn't change whether it should be apologized for." She looked at him. "No." She said, "I suppose it doesn't." She took her left hand out of her pocket. She looked at the scar along the fourth finger, the mark left by a ring worn for 3 months and then removed. It was faint. It was not invisible. He reached over and held her hand. Not the right hand, the left one, the one with the scar, and held it the way you hold something that matters, not tightly, just present. She let him. That was the moment she knew. Not in the managed, intellectual way she had been knowing it for months, assessing it, deciding whether to trust it, but in the body, in the place below thought where truth actually lands. She had made the right choice. Not because he was a duke, not because the arrangement was favorable, not because it had rescued her from a father's house and an impossible position. Those were the external facts of the situation, the architecture of the arrangement, and they were real, but they were not the thing. The thing was, he held her left hand. He had asked no questions about it. He had simply held it, in the June light, in the library that smelled of old paper, and she had let him, and that was the thing. Summer at Callaway Park brought the valley to the green that she had only seen once, at the wedding, and which she now understood was not a fixed state, but a process. Every week, a slightly different shade, a slightly different weight to the air. The river below the rise running differently in different weather. The whole landscape in constant slow conversation with itself. She walked it most mornings. This was new. She had not been, in her previous life, a woman who walked for pleasure in the mornings, partly because the Hertfordshire landscape did not invite it in the same way, and partly because her previous life had not contained many mornings that felt like her own, to use as she chose. These mornings were hers. She used them to think, which is what she had always needed mornings for, and which she had rarely had the space to do properly. She thought about what she was reading, which was currently a book on the geology of the valley that his grandfather had annotated thoroughly, if not always accurately. She thought about the estate management questions she had been working through with the agent. She thought about the letter she was drafting to Darwin, a genuine letter, making a genuine argument about an aspect of the subsidence theory that she believed contained an inconsistency, which she had drafted 4 times and which was improving with each draft. He was usually already at his correspondence by the time she returned from her walks. She would find him at the library desk with the estate papers, and they would share a breakfast, and he would ask what she had been thinking about. And she would tell him, and he would respond with something that was occasionally agreement, and occasionally a different angle, and occasionally a question that made her think better about what she had already been thinking. This was, she had decided, the finest possible quality in another person. Not agreement, not reflection, but engagement. Someone who pushed back with actual thought and received her pushback in return and took it seriously. She had not had this before. She had not, she realized, carefully, without drama, simply as an accurate observation about her own history, been truly known before. She had been assessed. She had been categorized. She had been declared valuable or not valuable by people who were looking at the category and not the person. Her father, who had never looked at her long enough to see past the problem she represented. The Pemberton arrangement, which had wanted a performance she was not able to sustain. This was different. This was a man who had said, "You were right about the Bengal roots." Who had said, "That is a specific thing, which is different from a small thing." Who had held her scarred hand without asking why it was scarred. Who wrote 3 pages about a coral reef paper and sent her a Venetian diplomat's letters with the good pages marked. Who had heard her described as worthless and had, the next morning, crossed a room to ask what she thought about maritime cargo routes. She was not going to say the word she was thinking. Not yet. Possibly not for some time. She was precise about language, and that particular word was so large and so frequently misused that she intended to wait until she was certain she was using it correctly, which was her approach to words generally, and felt like the right approach to this one specifically. But she knew what she was building in herself. She knew what was accreting, tide by tide, in the slow, patient way of structures that are built to last. She knew what she would say, someday, when the moment was as true as the word required. She would say, "This is what it feels like to be seen." Not by a title, not by an arrangement, not by the favorable terms of a winter negotiation, by a person. Across a parlor, across a dinner table, across letters and coral reefs, and the frozen East Garden, and the May light in the church, and the June light in the library, and the morning green of the valley below the rise. She had been worthless, her father declared. The Duke had offered twice the dowry. Neither of those things was the point. The point was, she had counted 7 letters in a terrible moment, and someone had heard her doing it, and had wanted to know what a person sounds like when they hold themselves together in the cold, and had come to find out. And she had let him. That was the beginning. Everything else, the estate, and the library, and the letters about coral reefs, and the morning walks, and the hand held without explanation, was what you build on a beginning that is honest. She stood at the library shelves on a July morning with a notebook in which she was cataloging her grandfather-in-law's natural philosophy collection. She was on volume 43, which was a work on the taxonomy of British insects published in 1798, and annotated by the grandfather with increasingly bewildered marginalia. And the sun came through the tall windows and made the dust in the air visible, and outside the valley was an astonishing green, and she thought, I am here. Not I have arrived. Not I am safe. Not even I am well. Simply, I am here. In a library, in summer, with a notebook, counting books. Here. Which was, she had decided, where the story actually started. Not in a cold corridor with plaster walls and a father's careless voice. Not in a January parlor with 7 letters and frost on the glass. Not in a negotiation about worth and dowry conducted without her presence. Here, in the library, with the books still to count. She finished counting the natural philosophy section by mid-July. It contained, in total, 211 volumes, of which 47 were significantly annotated by the grandfather, 23 were annotated by his successor, and 3 were annotated by what appeared to be a very young person who had drawn animals in the margins rather than written words, which Cecily found to be a perfectly reasonable response to the works in question. She reported this to Edward at dinner. He said, "My father. He was 8 or 9 when he started using the library. My grandmother allowed it on the condition that he didn't bend the spines." "He bent some spines," Cecily said. "I know," he said. She knew too. She chose not to notice. Cecily thought about this, about a grandmother who chose not to notice a bent spine because there was a child in the library who loved books, and that mattered more than perfect condition. About the particular quality of love that expresses itself in deliberate unawareness of small wrongs. "I would like to have met her," she said. "She would have liked you considerably," he said. "She was the one who read the natural philosophy section. The bewildered marginalia about the insects is hers." Cecily put down her fork. "I thought it was your grandfather's." "Everyone does. My grandfather never read that section. He bought it because he thought it looked well." Cecily looked at the wall, where a portrait of a woman in the dress of the 1790s looked back at her with an expression of composed intelligence. "That is her," Edward said. Cecily looked at the portrait for a long moment. The woman in it had her hands folded in her lap, and she was looking at the painter with the expression of someone who was deciding whether to find the situation interesting and had decided yes. "I see," Cecily said. "She would," he said, "have been very interested in your letter to Darwin." Cecily had sent the letter to Darwin in July, on the 5th draft, which she had decided was the version that was both correct and readable, without being either too deferential or too blunt. She had not told him she was going to send it. She had told him after. He had read it, the draft she kept, and had said that the argument about the inconsistency in the subsidence theory was sound, and that Darwin would either respond with a reasonable counterargument or would be annoyed, and would not respond at all. Darwin had, in fact, responded. The letter had arrived the previous week. It was 3 pages long and contained a counter-argument that was reasonable, but did not, in Cecily's assessment, fully address the point she had raised, and she was now drafting her reply. "Tell me," Edward said, "what his counter-argument actually was. You've only told me you're replying to it." "He says the inconsistency I identified is an artifact of the data available at the time of writing, and that more recent observations from the Pacific partially resolve it." "Which is interesting," she said, "because it means he agrees there is an inconsistency. He simply thinks the resolution is already on its way." "Is it?" "I don't know," she said. "I would need to read the Pacific observations. Do we have them?" We have a correspondence with a naval officer in the South Pacific who sends reports on natural observations. My grandfather began it. I have continued it, mostly out of habit. There may be relevant material. Cecily stared at him. You have a correspondence with a naval officer in the South Pacific about natural observations. Since about 1820, he said. The current officer is the third generation. His grandfather began it with mine. They observe the reef formations. Cecily stood up from the dinner table. I need to see that correspondence, she said. It's in the fourth cabinet in the East Study, he said. The one with the blue latch. I'll show you after dinner. She sat back down. She ate the rest of her dinner with the focused efficiency of someone who is enduring the remainder of an activity so that they can reach the thing that matters. He watched her do this with the expression that she had come to know was his version of amusement. Not a smile exactly, more a settling in the face, a warmth that arrived in the eyes before it reached anywhere else. She caught him watching.
What?
She said.
Nothing,
he said. I'm glad you're here. It was said simply, not as a performance of gladness, simply as a true thing that he had decided to say because it was true. She looked at him for a moment. So am I, she said. She had not said it before. She had thought it, with increasing frequency, with increasing certainty. But she had not said it until this particular evening at the dinner table in the Callaway Park dining room, with the portrait of the grandmother on the wall and the Pacific Reef correspondence waiting in the East Study and Darwin's letter requiring a reply. So am I. It landed between them in the quiet of the room. He nodded, just once. They finished dinner and went to the East Study, and she opened the fourth cabinet with the blue latch, and found inside it the beginning of something she had not known she was looking for. 40 years of careful observation from the other side of the world. In the handwriting of 3 generations of naval officers about the very reefs she had read about in a book she had found in a country house library in January, in the worst morning of a very bad year. Cecily sat on the floor of the East Study with the letters around her and read. He sat in the chair nearby and read his own papers, and occasionally they exchanged remarks, and occasionally they were silent. And the candles burned lower, and outside Callaway Park the valley was dark, and the river was running, and the July stars were out over Wiltshire. And she read, and she was here, in the precise and absolute way that means you are not surviving somewhere, but living in it. Here, with the letters. Still counting. August arrived with heat that Wiltshire rarely bothered to produce, and the estate took on a different quality. The river running lower, the fields past harvest, the mornings hazy before they cleared into an almost transparent blue. The household adjusted its rhythm slightly, the way old houses adjust to seasons, and Cecily adjusted with it, finding that her mornings extended later into the day, before the heat made reading uncomfortable, and her evenings stretched earlier into the darkness of the library where the thick stone walls kept the temperature civilized. She had, by August, begun to find the rooms of Callaway Park familiar. This is not the same as feeling at home. It is a preliminary state, a kind of mapping. You know where things are. You know the sounds the house makes at night. You know which floorboard speaks when stepped on, and which window sticks, and which of the fireplaces draws well, and which requires patience. She was in the mapping stage, which is a good stage, because it is the stage that comes before the deeper thing and makes the deeper thing possible. The staff had adjusted to her in much the same way. The housekeeper, Mrs. Parrish, had initially received her with the careful deference of a woman whose authority had been well established for 16 years, and who was making a professional assessment of the threat level represented by the new mistress. Cecily had assessed the situation accurately on her first day and had asked Mrs. Parrish's opinion on 6 household matters before offering her own, which had communicated, with some precision, her understanding of how things were arranged and her intention to work with that rather than against it. By August, Mrs. Parrish brought her tea in the mornings without being asked and had taken to mentioning, in passing, small household decisions that she would previously have handled alone, not because she needed guidance, but because she had decided Cecily's opinion was worth collecting. This was, as far as Cecily was concerned, exactly right. She did not want to manage the household. She wanted to understand it and be useful to it, and be known by it as someone whose presence was a good thing. This was a different ambition than the ambition she had been assigned by her circumstances, the ambition to make a match, to secure a position, to find someone to take responsibility for her future from her father's unwilling hands. That ambition had never been hers. It had been the shape the world offered her, and she had inhabited it because there was no other available shape, and inhabited it badly because it did not fit. This shape fit. Not perfectly. She did not think shapes fit perfectly. She thought you grew into them over time, and adjusted, and the shape adjusted back, and eventually there was something that worked because 2 people who were genuinely paying attention had made it work. She was paying attention. He was paying attention. She thought, on a Thursday morning in August, when the heat was already significant at 9 o'clock, and she was sitting in the East study with the naval correspondence arranged in 3 chronological piles on the floor around her, that she had never in her life been in a place where someone was paying that quality of attention to her, and she was paying the same quality back. And what it created between them was something she was still finding the language for. She had drafts. She had respect, which was real but insufficient. She had trust, closer, growing. She had the word she had been avoiding because she was precise about language, and this word was so large. She sat on the floor of the East study with the letters from the South Pacific around her, and thought, I am going to have to say it at some point. She was not a person who avoided true things indefinitely. She was, in fact, quite bad at it. She had told Mr. Fawcett at dinner that he was wrong about the Bengal roots. She had told Edward in the East Garden in January that she didn't know how to be seen by someone who was actually looking. She had said, so am I, over the dinner table without rehearsing it. She was going to have to say this too. The only question was when. The when turned out to be a Saturday afternoon in late August, which was not a remarkable Saturday in any external way. The heat had broken the day before, replaced by the kind of clear, cool air that England sometimes produces in the late summer as a reminder of what it can do when it chooses. The valley below the rise was green again, in a different way than the June green. Drier, a little dusty at the margins, but still extraordinary. She found him in the garden after lunch, sitting on the stone bench near the oak tree, reading a report on wheat yields from the north of the estate. He was reading it with the same focused attention he brought to everything, which she had noticed early and thought of as one of the most attractive things about him. The fact that his attention did not vary in quality based on whether the audience was a person or a document. She sat down on the bench. He moved the report slightly so she had room. She looked at the valley for a moment. She said, I want to say something. He put the report down. She said, I know we have been careful, and I think being careful was right. I think I needed to be sure that I was saying this because it was true, and not because I was relieved or grateful or adjusted to the circumstances. Those are real things, but they are not this. He was quiet and listening. I am, she said, carefully, very attached to you. That's the precise word. Not a small word, not a managed word. I mean the actual thing. She looked at him. He had the expression she had come to know as the one where he was feeling something considerable and holding it with the same care he held everything, not performing the feeling, but not hiding it either. I love you, he said. I have, I think, since you told me Darwin would probably be annoyed by your letter and send a reasonable counter-argument. That was when I was certain. Cecily looked at him. That was July, she said. Yes. It's August. Yes, he said. I was waiting for you to be ready to hear it. She sat with this for a moment. She thought about the 7 letters counted twice, about the 4 months of correspondence, and the coral reef paper, and the Venetian diplomat's letters, and the hand held in June without questions. About every morning in this valley, and every evening in the library, and every dinner where they talked about actual things with each other, as though actual things were what conversation was for. She thought about being worthless. She thought about twice the dowry. She thought, neither of those things was ever the point. I love you, she said. That is also what I was saying. He reached over and took her left hand in his. The scarred hand. The one she had kept in her pocket for 3 years. He held it the way he always held it. Present, without pressure, simply there. She did not put it back in her pocket. She looked at the valley. She was here. She was known. She was, without any announcement or performance or ceremony, precisely and completely where she was meant to be. The valley below the rise was green in the late summer light, and the river was running at its low August level, and the oak tree behind the bench made a good shade, and the stone under them was warm from the morning sun, and Cecily Vane, who was now Cecily Calloway, Duchess of Ashvere, though she thought of herself mostly as Cecily, held the hand that was holding hers, and looked at the world she had been given, and understood, very precisely, that she had not been given it. She had arrived at it, by her own navigation, using the only equipment she had ever had, a fast mind, an honest tongue, a refusal to perform what she did not feel, and the capacity, which she had once thought was her difficulty, and had slowly come to understand was her great and necessary quality, to wait for the true thing, rather than accept the convenient one. Her father had declared her worthless. A duke had offered twice the dowry, and she had stood in a cold garden in January and said why, and heard the real answer, and made her own decision from there. That was the story, not the one the Baron told at dinner parties, with himself in the knowing role. Not the one the drawing rooms assembled from the fragments of what they observed. The real one, small and specific and true. A woman counting 7 letters in a difficult morning. A man who heard her do it. And the long, careful, extraordinary work of 2 honest people building something that would last. Here, in the August light. Holding on, September, brought the letter that changed a small thing in Cecily's chest. The last small tightness she had not known was still there until it loosened. It came from Darwin himself. Not a reply to her second letter, which she had sent in August and which had not yet had time to generate a response. It was a separate letter, apparently prompted by a conversation Darwin had with a friend at the Royal Geographic Society, who had mentioned her name in connection with a paper being prepared on Pacific reef formations. Darwin wrote to say that her original argument, the one about the inconsistency in the subsidence theory, had been circulating among 3 of his correspondents and had generated discussion that he found, on reflection, more useful than his own counter-argument had acknowledged. He said, very precisely, that she had been right. He said he intended to note her contribution in his next paper on the subject, citing her by name. She read the letter 3 times. She was in the library. It was a Tuesday. The light was coming in at the angle that meant mid-morning. She was alone, because Edward had gone with the estate agent to look at the North Fields, and she had the library entirely to herself, which she still occasionally appreciated with the specific pleasure of someone who had spent years in rooms that were not quite hers. She sat at the library desk with Darwin's letter in both hands. She thought about being 17 and finding her father's natural philosophy section, which was small and not particularly well chosen, and reading through it in the specific manner of someone who is reading for their life, not for pleasure, not for requirement, but because the books were the place where the world made the most sense, and the world outside them made the least. She thought about the mathematics tutor who had written to her for 1 year and 8 months, until her father had asked what the expense was for, and she had had to explain, and the correspondence had ended. She thought about the geography she had read by candlelight when she was supposed to be sleeping, and the history she had hidden in her room, and the natural philosophy she had memorized, because it was the kind of knowledge you could keep with you when you couldn't keep the book. She thought about her father saying, "A waste of a woman's eyes." She thought about being 22 and standing in a country house parlor, counting letters and not crying. She thought about Edward asking, "What did you think of the subsidence theory?" She sat with Darwin's letter for a long time. Then she folded it carefully, exactly, along its original lines, and put it in the box where she kept things that mattered. She picked up her notebook. She began the reply. It took her 2 hours and 4 drafts. She was precise about her language. She acknowledged his note, corrected one small point of his that had still not been adequately addressed, offered 2 new observations from the naval correspondence she had been working through, and suggested that if his next paper would benefit from a discussion of those observations, she was available for that correspondence. She signed it, Cecily Calloway. Not Miss Vane, not the Duchess of Ashvere, though that was the form that would have been expected. Her name, her own. She left the letter on the desk to be posted. She stood up and went to the window. The valley was fully September now, the green shifting toward the colors that came before autumn, a kind of burnishing at the edges of the leaves. The river was at its fullest after the August rains. From where she stood, she could see the far edge of the estate, where the land rose toward the chalk hills, and on the hill road, small in the distance, 2 figures walking, Edward and the agent, returning from the North Fields. She watched them for a moment. Then she turned back to the library, and the books still to count. Her name was in Darwin's letter. Her argument had been discussed. She had been right. Not because her father had declared her anything. Not because a title had been bestowed. Not because twice the dowry had been paid or an arrangement had been reached in a winter sitting room. Because she was right. Because she had read the paper carefully and found the thing that needed finding and said it, clearly, in her own name, without waiting for permission. That was the worth. That had always been the worth. She had known this, in the way you know things about yourself that the world spends considerable effort convincing you are wrong. She had kept it in the closed rooms, the ones she opened slowly, the ones she was still opening. She went back to the desk. She opened her notebook to the page where she had left off cataloging the natural philosophy section, volume 98, A study of tidal patterns around the British Isles published in 1804, annotated by the grandmother with observations from her own walks along the Wiltshire River, 3 of which observations were, in Cecily's assessment, more accurate than the published text. She smiled at this. She picked up her pen. She kept going.